And to segue to our lesson, it's not even that. It's we put into the Bible a lot of us, and everything that I preached on was biblical. And yet people who will say I'm a biblical-based Christian would be uncomfortable because it is usually when people say that they're biblical Christians, what they mean is a certain particular brand of understanding and theology of biblical. There's so much in the Bible that for me to read certain passages of, we're all selective. We're all selective. So again, whether we're talking about suffering, whether we're talking about the gender of God, whether we're talking about anything, we impose a lot. And so just reading the Bible as what it says can be threatening. And I think that is just just to admit that to ourselves. A phrase I heard yesterday a couple times in a group was biblical family, biblical family. And I thought, which one? The man with all his wives and flocks and children and slaves? That one? The man and his property? That's the biblical marriage you want to go to? It is a false belief that the Bible preaches a man, a woman, and their 2.3 kids and the white picket fence. That is a modern American understanding of biblical value. And so all of these lessons that are looking at the Bible are revealing that we're not actually always reading the Bible for what it says. We're reading it for what we have imposed on it.
It's also on the same line, similar lines as the people that we've seen, my family has seen interviews with, they say, they believe in the Constitution. Like, well, have you read the Constitution? Well, no. They believe in the parts of the Constitution or parts of the Bible that they've been hearing from the people that they
trust.
That they trust.
Trust, sure.
But they want the condensed version from those people, but if you contradict the condensed version that they've been going to believe, then you get the same fight or flight response, even though it's like you open up, the Constitution is not a large read. It's like you can open up the segment and say, this is what it says that you're missing.
Part of the Bible, because the Bible is a long read.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
That is a long read.
So anyway, sorry.
Speaking of, let's jump in.
I'm going to throw in one more thing.
Okay.
Before I forget, instead of singing Lord have mercy, what it would be if we say, Lord, be woo me.
Yeah.
If I'm remembering
Yeah.
what you said, right?
Yeah.
What would that experience? Lord, be woo me, Lord, be woo me, Lord, be woo me with us, or something like that. It would be a whole different.
Well, and notice how many he's were still throughout the service, how many masculine images were still throughout the service. It's hard to excise everything.
Yeah.
The Kyrie and the hymn of praise is got a lot of masculine language.
I was so
in
saying
there.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of highlights if we did a service where we replaced everything with more feminine imagery and words and concepts, it would be different. Mm-hmm. Probably something we want to prepare people for, but it would be different because we're so used to the masculine as the norm, that to even just include the word she is jolting, let alone to start changing. We have, oh God, power, wisdom, might, strength, and power and riches be unto you.
Yeah.
Why is that the value system? Why not mercy, love, and compassion is yours? Why not creation is yours? Why not, rebirth is yours? But that's what we think is normal. So anyway, let's move on.
Yeah.
I'll just start us off, and then I'll call out a name. That person can read a section. They can call out a name, and we'll go through this. The Theodicy of Jesus. In the Gospel of John, Jesus and his disciples encounter a blind man. The disciples ask who sinned, his parents or him, that he was blind. This simple statement reveals how strongly we want to believe there is justice in the tragedies of the world. Maybe if we have an easy answer to why bad things happen, the will of God, we don't have to have so much empathy for suffering people. But Jesus dismisses this belief altogether. His statement, so the glory of God can be revealed, is a bit unclear. Did God really blind a man for most of his life just so when Jesus encountered him, he could be made to see? That seems a bit over the top. A loving God would not create suffering just to show off. As we saw in the temptation story, that kind of attention-seeking behavior to glorify yourself is the result of the Satan, not God. It is more likely Jesus means there is unaccounted for suffering and pain in this world, and yet what is amazing about God is God wants to heal it. God's glory is revealed in the healing, restoring, and mending of people, communities, in the world. This would mean that God does not create or intend for birth defects, illness, and so forth as part of some plan. If so, Jesus would not heal the sick. Jesus reveals God's intention by healing constantly, restoring people in body, mind, and spirit. Another example of this comes in Luke when Jesus has posited a similar question. He reminds people of a recent event, the Tower of Siloam collapsing and killing people. Do they really believe that the people crushed by the tower were sinful, whereas the people who escaped were not? Is God's punishment that precise and controlling? Would God want to destroy people without giving them a chance to change? We don't see that in Jesus' actions. Jesus calls people to repent, as does John the Baptist, and he challenges people to change all the time. His parable of the weeds suggests that it is wise to give people time. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. Rich, tag.
Evil or unright. There are places in the Bible where Jesus seems to call actions and even people evil. When we read this, we think Jesus is literally viewing this person as horrible. But in Aramaic, the word is bisha, or bisha, which is better translated as unright, out of rhythm, not ready, not fit for its intended purpose. The starkest example of this is sexuality. When two consenting adults come together out of love and devotion, the act of sex is holy and good. Yet this same act, when forced upon someone, or when a child unprepared is exposed to it, it is damaging. It is evil. There is a right timing and place for almost everything. Things we would readily accept and find good at one point in our life would be unwelcome and hurtful another time. This calls us to wisdom and compassion, and to refrain from calling something evil in and of itself. Pregnancy in the Bible. This leads us to an important topic that resurfaces throughout the Bible: pregnancy. There are a plethora of stories in the Old Testament that speak of a woman's ability to have a child, or not, as God's action. From Sarah to Hannah to Elizabeth in the Gospel of Luke, we hear that God opened her womb to conceive. This has led to centuries of women being blamed for their ability to have children or not. Some would interpret these stories as God blessing good women with babies and denying unworthy women. Yet, a scan of human history and current life contradicts that completely. If God were in charge of who conceived, when and how many babies they had, the world would look shockingly different. Children would not be born to abusive or neglectful parents, let alone to rape victims, or to those whose body cannot handle giving birth. If God were controlling women's bodies in this way, we would see striking evidence to that fact, but we do not. We learn from Jesus that God is not controlling of creation, let alone people's bodies. If people are born blind in Jesus' time, if 100 needs healing from various ailments, and none of these were God's will, then why does fertility still to this day cause so much grief for women? It is important to remember that the writers of the Bible were not gynecologists or medical doctors. They were most likely all men who had only a cultural understanding of how conception occurred. Yet, because these phrases such as God heard her prayer and opened her womb occur several times, women to this day question if their infertility is their moral or spiritual failing. Systematic theology is a fancy term that means we are consistent in our theology. To be systematic about Jesus' claim that no one sinned yet someone is suffering, is to relate that to everything else. Birth defects, genetic conditions, infertility, and so on. In the same way I can blame my genes and not God for my horrible eyesight, we do not need to place the blame on anyone else for their abilities, including their ability to have children. Crucifixion and suffering. One of the biggest challenges to you get what you get for a reason theology comes in the suffering and death of Jesus. We cannot overlook this just because we might believe Jesus' death was for a larger purpose. Jesus was one of many in a long line of prophets before and after him who were killed by the powers that who were killed by the powers that because is that reading right?
The powers that be, because he was a threat.
Oh, okay. I was looking over the word be. The powers that be, because he was a threat. When he rose from the dead and began to appear to the disciples, Jesus bore the marks of his crucifixion on his body, a clear reminder of what had happened. The shock of Jesus' arrest and death is evident in the behavior of the disciples. It took months, years, and decades for early Christians to fully make sense of it. A Messiah who was not accepted by the religious leaders, a Messiah who did not defeat his enemies, a Messiah who was killed doesn't make any sense. But God lets their children's chosen one be killed in this way. As we continue reading in the book of Acts, we quickly realize that suffering not only happens when you are faithful, but that it might be because of your faith. Stephen was stoned to death. Peter was arrested several times. Paul was beaten and arrested numerous times. In fact, persecution for your faith was so common in Paul's time that he wrote letters of encouragement to the early churches he was affiliated with. He reminded the people that suffering produces endurance, then character, all good things. What a far cry from believing you are being punished by God if bad things happen to you. While we look more deeply at these many verses, I think you might begin to see the following is true. According to the Bible, suffering is very real and pervasive. Lamenting about your troubles was a healthy part of spirituality. God is never upset with us when we complain. Where God is in our suffering has changed over time. And through Jesus, we know that God does not want us to suffer. There are other forces out there that seek to harm us, but God is not one of them. Yay.
Thoughts?
No, I still think of the people who, because I had a mom who brought us up, God is punishing you. Where she got that from, I don't know. But when you're a kid, being told that over and over again. Yeah. And I another personal aside of that, I think all kids want to believe their parents and what they're told is true. You know, they grow up that way. This is the truth. This is reality. And so you're told something like that over and over again. And then, so that years later now, I was asking, would be asking my mother if she were alive, what are you suffering from?
Bad parenting.
It was her thing, projecting.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what the pastors used to say at Trinity Lutheran Church of Home City when she was growing up, too, back in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
So I don't know. But it's just, yeah, there's a mindset. God is punishing you.
Yeah.
Well, why?
Yeah. Other thoughts?
Well, we all tend to think God must be punishing me. Well, then we say that we never did anything wrong, so why is he punishing me? Surely he would know if you were innocent or guilty, so if you think that he's punishing you, then clearly deep down you must know maybe there is something I did wrong. So it's like we're both blaming God and also ourselves, but we're also not at the same time. We keep contradicting ourselves when it comes to God.
You can really poison your confidence, can't it?
It also leaves open that vacuum of looking for someone to explain what's going on, and if someone can find a way to spin that, you wind up with people who can convince other people to do terrible things, or convince people of terrible things about other people for their own gain.
I also think there's a level of, if I can figure out why that person's suffering, then I'm going to be okay.
Yeah.
I can game the system, and, you know, if I eat well and exercise, I will never get cancer, or I'll never get a bad disease, right? And the person who gets it, there must be something. They ate too much ice cream or something, right? We want to make sense of it so that we feel we have control and can avoid.
Yeah, they were a jerk, so as long as I'm not a jerk, I won't get hurt.
Right.
Sometimes I
Right.
see it as a reason to not care too. Like,
Yeah.
I don't have to donate money to that cause because they're just idiots. They'd rather sell themselves.
Yeah, well, that's being a jerk.
It is being a jerk.
Whenever there's a
Right.
murder, the first thing I would think is, oh, did the person know then? Oh, okay, then I'm safe. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, that wasn't a random murder.
Yeah, there are some
less
random
scary than-
murders
And there are random
that
murders.
are targeted.
Yeah, and then when that happens, it's more scary. And, ooh.
And just because the murder may have been targeted doesn't mean that they knew each other, because there are other ways it could be targeted, like for discrimination reasons.
Like that shooting.
Like, oh, this person was a woman, so that's why they were killed. This person was
Yes.
black, that's why they were killed.
Or the gay bar shooting,
I
the
know.
club last night in
Yeah, and even
Colorado.
then, you didn't even have to be gay, you just had to be in the gay bar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they can't tell if you're gay unless they see you being gay,
Well.
or you tell them. So as long as you're in the place where the gays congregate, you're marked as gay or just as bad as the gays.
I just finished a book called Time for the Truth. It's Minnesota authors who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, and they all wrote little essays, so every chapter is different. And the second to the last one was very interesting. It was someone who, I can't remember if they grew up in Minnesota, I don't think they did, but they said when they moved to Minnesota, we call it Minnesota nice, right? And
Yeah, because we live in Minnesota, so we think it's gotta be nice.
yeah, and so his perspective as a black man is, he said, it's interesting because there's a level of truth to it, but it's very shallow, because with it comes the perspective of, you know, we're nice as long as everyone is minding their own business and doing their part. And if there's a tragedy, you're not going to find anyone more generous to jump in and get your tractor out of the mud, because we all fall on hard times, but then the expectation is that you're self-sufficient and you keep to yourself and you don't let your dirty laundry air out. And so what he noticed was that Minnesota would be welcoming of immigrants that moved in, but they had to quickly assimilate and become self-sufficient within a very quick amount of time, or there was a deep irritation and frustration. Now we have a problem because you're not like us now.
You didn't play by those unspoken rules that nobody told you about.
Exactly. And so when there were communities that would come in who, because of laws, because of culture, because of all sorts of things, could not become immediately self-sufficient and fine, that was seen as a deficit on their problem, because look, we're fine over here, what's wrong with you? And I thought that was a very, very interesting understanding of how we don't want to admit that there might be circumstances we'd be in where we could not claw our way out. It's probably terrifying to think that if we were in the wrong situation at the wrong time, we would need ongoing help.
Well, we can't conceive of that because we've been given or born into.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't had to live through the Dust Bowl. So we haven't had to live through, 1870s and 1880s. There was also similar things that happened, like the Dust Bowl days. Farms were lost. Mary's been reading a book about what happened in the prairies of South Dakota when farms were lost left and right. And families trying to pick up and move, or dad moves away, to get a job, and then you never hear from him again. We don't experience that. And even when even here in Minnesota, those original governors, I could get the names all confused, Sibley and so on, when there was hard times out in southern Minnesota for the new farmers, the state legislature didn't care. It was a whole different mindset. Well, that's, they had just this. If they had just that, they wouldn't need our help.
Right.
Kind of talk. I can't remember all the particulars. It was also after the, quote, Indian uprising and the need for recovery after that. That if there was an attitude coming out of the governor at the time, that if they had just this, if they just that, they wouldn't need help.
Yeah.
And so they were not loved, as we might say today. To realize that's in our history,
Yeah.
And fairly recent history at that.
relatively speaking, but we forget it.
Quick.
There seems to be a very interesting parallel between this belief that you yourself can succeed, and if you don't, it is your own moral failing. And how might that subconsciously relate to suffering? If someone's suffering in any way, that it's not systems of evil, which we'll look at in the next lesson, but it is maybe God didn't cause your suffering, but you certainly did. And as long as I can figure out how to avoid it, and not be like you.
One thing that I struggle with, I agree with everything that's been said, and to me it seems so obvious that God doesn't cause our suffering, but yet at the same time, I often find myself wondering why God doesn't take things away. So like childhood cancer, for instance. He could I know he didn't cause it, but he could remove it, and he doesn't.
Or we also get into that, what I've learned over the years from my learning is why some people go through their, quote, miraculous cures,
Yeah, but not everybody gets that.
and not everybody gets it.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
And that is one of the lessons I was asked to write, was on miracles and divine intervention. So eventually, if we want to pick up on the second half at some point, because that is a big, big, big conversation with a lot of different perspectives to look at. But it is wrapped up with this of, okay, so God doesn't cause the suffering, but God allows it.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Does that mean God's not all merciful,
Yeah.
all loving?
The old David Hume argument, but he was
Yeah.
the one that proposed it,
Yeah.
first of all. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. What does that mean?
yep.
Along those lines, perspective is a big point that I keep thinking about when I think of the suffering going on in this world, because Christ has talked, Christ in the Bible does talk about there being something beyond what we're working with here. And so, yeah, we deal with pain and strife and terrible things in this life. And there is truth that, to the fact that these terrible things that happen do goad us into looking for solutions for them on our own and help us to discover new and great things, both medically and service-wise and such. But there's also the question of, to God, how great and terrible are these things when He knows if there's reincarnation. He knows what becomes of the spirit after the body passes. Is He just seeing that, yep, they're going through this pain this time, but there's another big reboot that they'll be going through in another cycle, and so this is just part of humanity's evolution versus, yeah, that's this person's going through this problem that they need to have, I need to intervene because I need this person to move past this point to kick the right people off in the right direction a little bit further.
Oh, there's so much fun that we could talk about with this.
Yeah,
but
I'm
Oh,
thinking
there's-
of debating with you on that too.
Well,
No, there's
So
a-
far.
I don't know,
So
but
many
really,
extra
really
never-
cool perspective on exactly that. And don't have time to jump into it, but it's really, really interesting. I'm going to close it up now. We did start a little bit late, but next week we're going to look at how the church history affected so much of how we view about suffering. And then if we have room and time, we'll look at what other faiths think about suffering, which is very interesting. Yeah.
When are we going to get to the point where we hear what's the exact fact of things so that I can feel good about everything?
Yeah.
Never, I know.
Next week, I promise. I promise
think that
next
happens
week.
like
Next
10
week?
minutes after we die and go to heaven.
And actually, when we talk about Earth, a small period of time, and having a big period of time, I guess that's kind of where I lean to. And
Yeah.
but I suppose next week you'll tell me that's not true either. I won't even have that.
Yeah. Good.
Gets back to what you defined maybe